if you had asked me 20 years ago what I thought about leaky gut, I would have told you it was pseudoscience. But again, Hippocrates was right. So all disease, you choose the disease, all disease comes from intestinal dysbiosis, which is simply saying that this complex ecosystem is broken of all these different guys interacting. And number two, every patient I've ever seen with a disease, you choose the disease, has measurements of leaky gut, that we can do a blood test and see leaky gut. And what's exciting is that we can follow people's leaky gut by asking them to take certain foods away from them, put certain foods in them, add probiotics, prebiotics, and what are called postbiotics. And you can watch leaky gut seal. And in fact, just before we came on, I saw a patient for the second time who had colitis and very positive markers for leaky gut and lots of markers of inflammation, and an older gentleman. And now in 3 months, his leaky gut markers are half what we started with. I can tell you that 100% of people with leaky gut have antibodies to wheat, to gluten. 100%. Never seen anyone who doesn't. Now, that is disappointing because most of us love bread and things like that. But the exciting thing is, when we take these foods away temporarily, but the exciting thing is, all these antibodies go away within 9 months to a year. In fact, this gentleman in 3 months, half his antibodies to wheat that we started with are now gone. And so, this guy can go, wow, all this misery you're putting me through by, taking away my beer and my bread. Look, I can see it. I got it. Okay. And, all right, I'm going to put up with this. But that's, it's really exciting, and that, these are variables that are changeable and you can measure these things. It's not pseudoscience. So that's what's kind of fun.
It's fun. I can attest to the fact that when I was 38 and they said it was progressing to Crohn's, what I went back and started to identify what were the things that might have made that happen. The biggest thing that happened to me is that I was going through a major career transition. I was extremely stressed from the inside out, felt like I was doing all the right things here. But what happens? The back starts severely getting inflamed. I was having sciatic pain down both legs, you name it, eczema all over. Like my whole body was just saying, hey, this is enough. You're crazy, right? So in order to avoid surgery on the back, which is of course what several of the doctors had said I needed because of severe spinal stenosis and severe inflammation and the herniated discs, I took heavy doses of ibuprofen, like the whatever it was, right? So now looking back, what happened is I killed all the good guys in my gut, and only the bad guys were in there throwing rave parties and doing what you're saying. And so then when I went in, the gastro doctor's like, oh my gosh, this is horrendous. Look at all this stuff that's happened in just the last 6 months. And so slowly starting to change that, pay attention to what we're doing to our bodies and then the reaction. I think so many people, and you talk about this a lot, you have to learn what works for you, right? And what I often go to a steak dinner. When I need a reset, I do a steak dinner. It's like my number one go-to. I don't eat it all the time, but it's amazing how that works. I've heard you explain this on other podcasts and other things. Can you just explain to our listeners why it sounds ludicrous? Because most people say, oh, that can't be super healthy, Scott. But why would that actually work? Because it's actually doing something in your system that's helping you. Correct?
Yeah. I spend a whole chapter on how the blue zones.
This is a good one.
aren't blue zones at all. At least that we ought to call them white zones, because the vast majority of blue zones, and again, I'm the only nutritionist who spent most of my career living in a blue zone, Loma Linda, California. And I get a kick out of people telling me what blue zone people eat and don't live there. But you actually look at the data, and 4 out of the 5 blue zones, Sardinia, Icaria, Crete, the Nagoyan Peninsula in Costa Rica, and the Okinawans, these people actually mostly are sheep and goat herders, and they eat a lot of goat yogurt, goat cheese, sheep cheeses, a lot. And they actually don't eat a whole lot of beans and grains. The Okinawans don't eat any green beans and grains. The Okinawans live on sweet potatoes. 85% of their diet is a purple sweet potato. And what nobody bothers to mention is that most of these long-lived people are smokers. And we've ignored, and people go, oh, well, yeah, they're really healthy, and the smoking doesn't bother them because they're really healthy. And nobody bothers to say, well, wait a minute, maybe the reason they live so long is because they're smokers. And so you actually look at Sardinia. And the reason Sardinia is interesting, that a bunch of people live up in the mountains and a bunch of people live down by the sea. Only the mountainous people have longevity. And what's really interesting is men in general don't live as long as women. I mean, we live about 7 years shorter than women, but the men in Sardinia live longer than the women, because about 95% of the men smoke and only about 25% of the women don't smoke. And so the longevity benefit to the men comes from their smoking. The same thing was true with the Catawbans in Papua New Guinea. And the Catawbans smoke like fiends. And there's never been a case of cancer. There's never been a case of heart disease, stroke. And they've been studied extensively by a fellow who's now deceased, Stefan Lindenberg. But everybody said, well, gosh, they're so healthy because, and the smoking doesn't bother them. And you go, wait a minute, are we sure we're not getting this backwards? And the same way on Crete, the same way with the Acciarolis south of Naples. Now, I'm not telling anybody to go out and smoke.
Right.
Certain after all. But it turns out that nicotine is probably one of the greatest contributors to longevity there is. Unfortunately, the delivery device has got some issues, but we now know that these compounds, nicotinic acid, nicotinamide riboside, NMN, these are all nicotine derivatives. And lo and behold, we now know, and I've written books about this, how it works to improve longevity. So if you want to live a long time, you ought to be a sheep herder or a goat herder, and don't smoke, but get some nicotine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is, and I talk about, Paul Simon said, a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. And Dan Butner, bless his heart, and I've talked to him, wants people to believe that the reason these people live a long time is because they eat beans and grains. No, those are negative aspects of their diet that are compensated for by all these positive aspects that he doesn't like. And it's okay. I'm sorry you don't like it, but in Loma Linda, 50% of the diet is dairy fat. And that doesn't come out in the stories. I was shocked when I became a professor there. And I went and talked to the people in the cafeteria, and I said, you're killing my patients. All you're giving them is cheese and butter and and all this milk product, yogurt, and you're killing them. And they go, we're kind of the longest living people in the United States. Pay attention, Sonny. But that doesn't come out in these stories.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. I was and I've heard you talk about this as well. I was in Europe and twice this past year, and I eat things that I don't normally eat. here. So I'll eat bread when I'm in Europe the whole time. And, I'm convinced maybe one of your sayings about olive oil is I eat so much bread, but I dip it and soak it in the olive oil, and it's quality, great olive oil, or even milk. Like in the airport in Greece, I had buffalo milk ice cream. And I don't eat ice cream at all. I haven't eaten ice cream in 5 years, but even gelato occasionally in Italy. Like these are things that the way that it's made are completely different. Speak to the listeners, why is it that some of these things are okay in some places and not in others? Because I think it's such a great point that you make.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems, and I have a number of patients who, we cure them of their autoimmune disease. I don't like to use that word, and they go to Europe, and who can resist? They have the croissants, and they have the pasta and the pizzas, and they have the gelato, and they don't react, and they go, "Oh, Dr. Gundry has cured me. I can have all these things." And they come back to the United States, and they have our bread and our pizza and our yogurt. And within a couple of weeks, they're on the phone going,
Yep.
"What the heck? My psoriasis just flared, or, I got bloody diarrhea. What the heck? I thought I was cured." No, they have very little glyphosate in Europe. And particularly in Southern Europe, their cows are A2 cows. And I'll have patients going, I'm lactose intolerant, and there's no lactose in the gelato in Italy because I can tolerate it just fine. I go, there's plenty of lactose in gelato in Italy, but it's A2 milk. And your buffalo ice cream was A2. And lots of their cheeses, sheep is A2, goat is A2. And most of the cows in France and Italy and Switzerland are A2 cows. So that's why people did just fine. But again, it's the glyphosate in our food. Most of our foods are completely contaminated with glyphosate. Even our wines are contaminated with glyphosate. We just entertained some friends over in Italy who, the wife in particular says, "Oh, I can't have red wine because I get really bad headaches." And we said, maybe you ought to give it a try over here. And I'd go, alcohol's very low in it. And she started drinking like a fish. And, next morning, any headaches? No. No, the alcohol is much lower. And then I'd show her the bottle. And I go, well, actually, it's the same or maybe even higher. Well, what the heck? It's sulfites. No, I said, look, it says sulfites on the bottle. And it's the dumb glyphosate that we spray. All of our vines are sprayed with glyphosate.
It's a major difference. I mean, we went to a couple Tuscan wineries, and I brought a couple bottles back, and one of my great buddies is a level 2 som, and we sat and opened a bottle and then got into the second bottle. And the next morning I was like, tell me how crazy it is that if we drank a California red the same way, we would be sick for a week. But, we had a cup, maybe a glass or two more than we normally would, because he probably has a little more than I would, but the norm is it's part of his job. He has to.
Sure, he has to.
He has to. It's part of his job. And it's like you and the diet, like he has to do it. But the point is that it's such a major difference that how you feel, that you don't have to convince anybody. That should be the easiest thing to trial on yourself, is just have some wine there and some wine here and look at the differential. Your body will thank you.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And you're right. I say it over and over again. The only purpose of food is to get olive oil into your mouth. And they use olive oil on everything, in everything. Multiple studies show that these super old people are usually consuming 1 liter of olive oil per week. That's like 10 to 12 tablespoons a day. And it's because olive oil has all these compounds that I write about called polyphenols. And polyphenols, it turns out, we now know, are one of the favorite foods for gut bacteria. And so they're actually an important prebiotic that none of us really understood. So it's with every year, we're beginning to, understand really the complex nature of this fascinating ecosystem. I'll give you another example. I have a product that's pretty good for growing hair, and it's
Okay. Well, I
several
could use that because I don't have any. So
several bacteria species called L. reuteri or reuteri, whoever wants to pronounce it. And it turns out that there's some really cool animal studies that show that this particular bacteria stimulates skin and hair growth. And lo and behold, recent evidence shows that this bacteria produces a lot of oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is the love hormone, and women produce lots of oxytocin after they give birth, among other things, to start making milk, but it makes you bond with your baby. And when you're in love, oxytocin goes through the roof. Well, it turns out that this bacteria is responsible for producing oxytocin all by itself. So if you have this bacteria, then you're going to be a much more loving, engaging individual than if you don't have this bacteria. Same way with oxalates. Everybody's up in arms that oxalates kill you and it's painful and it's awful. Well, it turns out that we normally would have a set of bacteria that just love to eat oxalates. They just think it's delicious. Favorite food. Oh yeah, oxalate. Give me a bunch of spinach. I love it. Turns out, because of the fact that we've been taking antibiotics forever and we've been feeding it to our animals, we've killed off all these organisms. So what would normally, in a normally functioning system, be totally harmless, oxalates, now a lot of us are sitting ducks because we don't have that protection barrier. So the book is, here's how we got it so screwed up, and here's how to put it back together. It does take some work on people's parts, but it's so worth it.
it is worth it. I feel like it's always work too, meaning that, the body goes through cycles, and you really, sometimes the sensitivity to something hasn't been the same in your life. And all of a sudden something changes and you're like, wait, I've never not had a problem with that. I did Viome a couple, maybe a year and a half ago, just to identify some of the things that were good and bad. And I'm sure there's some fault in that. I'll let you comment on it, but I did it mainly because I was trying to understand food sensitivity and kind of what are some things that my body might be more apt to take in. And a lot of the things that you talk about are the basics. The spinach was one that we ate a lot of, though. And that's something that my wife puts in all kinds of stuff, eggs, everything. And I've limited it. I stopped eating Brussels sprouts. I stopped eating things I really love, but it just doesn't work for me. There's nothing that I could do. I can't make the Brussels sprouts work for me, no matter how bad I want them, no matter how much I love the flavor. And so these are some of the things that I think it's a constant journey, right? And we have to be aware of it. And, for what do you think of the things that people can use out there to test these items on their own? What are some ways that they can do it to kind of get them? Not everybody can be your patient, but maybe everybody that wants to they can reach out to you in some way. We'll talk about that at the end of the show. But what are some things you recommend, Dr. Gundry?
Well, so believe it or not, I've now set up a telehealth company called Gundry Health, where people actually, with a finger prick of their finger, can do a leaky gut test and food sensitivity, and they can actually find out without seeing me in person. I've trained people to interpret it. So they go to gundryhealth.com. And so it's like getting me with a computer, I guess.
Right.
But in general, we found that particularly with autoimmune disease, that number one, getting rid of grains and beans that aren't pressure cooked, and the nightshade family, tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, eggplant, and goji berries. Believe it or not, goji berries are a nightshade. Sorry about that. And peanuts and cashews is a very good place to start. Many people do react to dairy that's not fermented. A number of people react to eggs, both egg white and egg yolks. You brought up spinach. There's a class of lectins that I haven't written about before because people think I'm crazy enough, but there's a class of lectins that are called aquaporins. And we don't have the time, but these certain plants have aquaporins that open and close water pores. They breathe through them. They move water through their roots and their stems with canals controlled by aquaporins. We have aquaporins in the wall of our gut. We have aquaporins in our blood-brain barrier. We have aquaporins in our myelin sheath. And it turns out that spinach happens to have an aquaporin. So do bell peppers, so does tobacco, so does potatoes, so does corn, so does tomatoes, and so does soy. And if you're sensitive to aquaporins, and we can test for that, then these guys can cause leaky brain. They can cause MS. A number of my patients with MS love spinach. We're big time spinach eaters. And lo and behold, we found that when we tested for them, they were sensitive to the spinach aquaporin.
So
and
fascinating.
we took their favorite food away from them, their MS, got so much better. And again, that does not mean that everybody reacts to spinach, but if you've got these issues, particularly neurologic issues, then we really should, look into these other factors. And you're right. One man's meat is another man's poison. And just because you, for instance, react to these things doesn't mean you always react to them. I'll tell you a rather funny story. I was sent a gentleman who is high up in one of the social media companies because he had a really severe, painful autoimmune disease of his joints. And he was on a couple of drugs and they were making him sicker and making him a diabetic. And so Tony Robbins and Peter Diamandis actually sent him to me. And so we did all this tests, and sure enough, he had big time leaky gut, and he reacted to dairy and he reacted to eggs, among other things. So he says, "Oh, you can't take eggs away from me. You can't." He said, "I have an omelet every day of my life. You can't." And I said, "Look, you're the guy with the pain. Come on." And he said, "Okay, all right, I'm giving him up." So his pain rapidly goes away. We get him off his meds. He's a happy guy. His leaky gut is getting better and better. And about 9 months into his leaky gut's pretty much gone. And he said, "Can we retest me for eggs, please?" And I said, "Sure." So we retest him. This time, egg whites are okay. He's still sensitive to egg yolks. And I said, "Good news. We can have you have an egg white omelet." He said, "Oh, thank you. Thank you. You saved my life." 3 days go by. Phone rings. It's him. He said, "I am in such pain." And I said, "What'd you do?" And he said, "Well, I know what it is now, but I went home and I had an egg white omelet for breakfast. I had an egg white omelet for lunch. I had an egg white omelet for dinner. I did that again yesterday 3 times. And I was just making my egg white omelet this morning." And he said, "Probably did it too quick." And I said, "Yeah, right, dummy, bye." And now he's having egg whites and egg yolks and he's fine. But
It's so hard. It's so hard when even the choices of your meals, it's hard enough in the fast-paced world that we're in, where people make good food decisions, but it's also really difficult just to make the right decision 3 times a day. I found it really liberating growing up in an Italian family, food is everything. You talk about nightshades, you know, the spaghetti sauce, the eggplant parmesan, all the things that we grew up eating. I didn't have issues when I was growing up because I guess of how maybe how things were prepared. And so today it's a little bit different, but what I was going to say is I started to actually do a little bit of the intermittent fasting. And I know that's the term it's used now. You've been talking about limited eating windows for a long time in your research. But it's amazing how just removing one of the decisions helped me make better decisions all day long.
Yeah, and I spend a lot of time in Gut Check showing the benefits of time restricted eating, and there are multiple benefits. Among other things, it's crazy to think that your gut should be bombarded 16 hours a day with food, and yet the average American actually eats 16 hours a day in one way or another. And you got to give the gut a rest, and it has to repair. There has to be downtime for cleaning. And yes, sleep is really useful for that. But if you're eating right before you go to bed, and then something slams into your stomach right after you get up, there's very limited time for their rest in your gut, and it's got to have downtime. It's got to have repair time.
It's I started wearing the Whoop in 2019, and there were a couple. Oh yeah, he has one on, listeners. So one of the most, because again, I'm biohacking myself every day. I'm trying to learn about my body, what works, what doesn't, what can I do, what can I do, and really taking control of the challenges that I had with the autoimmune stuff earlier. Somehow I have a bell that's going off, even though I have do not disturb all over my computer. So that's on me. But the reality is the Whoop has taught me a couple of big rocks. Rock number one, the more sleep I get, the better my body recovers. And going back all those years when I had the issues, sleep was deprived significantly. Number two, alcohol, especially 3 hours prior to bed, is never a good thing. It's like a war going on all the way until the body finally relaxes and releases you into good sleep. And the last one, and probably the worst thing was the fact that if I eat close to bed, my body it's just sleep is horrible, no REM, no deep. And so I study this, and having 3-4 years of this now has really made a big difference and made changes in my life, that it was nice to read your book and kind of see some of those things are actually valuable and are validated, not just by my brain.
Yeah, and I've been writing about, and Dale Bredesen, who wrote The End of Alzheimer's, and I are good friends. And, it's really important. We have to have a period of washing of our brain, where your brain literally goes through a wash cycle. And it's the glymphatic system of your brain. And it usually occurs during deep sleep. And deep sleep normally should occur fairly soon after you go to sleep. And that's when the brainwashing should occur. And you actually have to have a huge amount of blood flow to your brain during this time. Now, the problem is if you eat anywhere close to going to bed, all your blood flow is down in your gut. And so it's not available to go out and wash your brain. And I'm old enough to remember when we ate lunch, my mother would make us, sit there for an hour before we went swimming.
Right. The old rule, the wives,
they
called it a wives' tale forever, right?
You'd get cramps and die. Well, there was truth to the wives' tale, because all of your blood flow was down in your gut, and you wouldn't have as much blood flow down into your, legs and arms, which is true. That's why one of the most hilarious things is you should eat before you go do an exercise or before you go to the gym. That's the stupidest thing you can do, because it's the blood flows down into your gut and it doesn't go where it should go. So it's the same thing. And, preferably 3 hours. If you can get 3 hours, without eating before you go to bed, 3 to 4 hours is great. You'll be able to do a brainwash and it'll pay off long term.
It's a game changer. I mean, getting rid of beer never did me good, but having a dark liquor like a bourbon, fine, a glass of wine or so. But once you start getting upwards of a night of fun, it becomes not a good thing no matter what. We all know that. If you like clips like this, I have a similar clip here. And if you want to watch the full video, click here.